I'll just reintroduce myself from the last session. Dick Morningstar, I'm the chairman of the Global Energy Center here. I thought that the talk by Secretary Moniz was terrific in setting the stage for this conversation. I know there's been already a lot of talk obviously about the Paris Agreement and Trump's decision and so forth. I'm excited here to be joined here on the stage by three terrific panelists, just going from, see, this is right to left. David Livingston, who has been here many times and is an associate fellow in Carnegie's Energy and Climate Program, where he focuses on geoeconomics, markets, and risk. And he previously served as the inaugural Robert F. Strauss Fellow for Geoeconomics at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and has worked with the WTO in Geneva. All that's accurate?
More or less.
Then we have Matthias Duwe, who's the head of climate at the Ecologic Institute, which is one of our co-sponsors here in these last couple of days, where he primarily focuses on EU energy and climate policy. And prior to joining the Ecologic Institute, Matthias worked with the Climate Action Network Europe, during which time he participated in the European Climate Change Program and the development of the Climate and Energy Package. Okay? And certainly, last but not least, is Jennifer Turner, who's been the director of the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center for quite a while.
18 years, thank you very much.
Okay, you said it. I wasn't
one of the
people.
Say. I'm one of those strange people who doesn't change their job in D.C. So.
But she also leads a number of initiatives dealing with water, energy, food issues in China and other countries, and is the editor of the Wilson Center's journal, the China Environment Series. Mm-hmm. And she has her PhD in public policy and comparative politics. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to sort of raise a few questions here at the beginning, and then turn it over to each of the panelists to speak very briefly for about 3 minutes or so, and then open it up for audience, and hopefully audience comments, not just questions. And remember, this event is on the record, unless otherwise noted, and you can engage on Twitter by using the hashtag AC Tipping Points. And I'm going to say this now so that in case I forget at the end, you all know the next session will start at 1, and there'll be box lunches in the lobby. And at the end of this session, I'm just going to introduce the mural artist, Omaid Sharifi, and I think everybody is supposed to sign the mural during lunch. So just to begin very briefly from a more macro standpoint as to what the Trump decision on Paris means, one question, and some of these Secretary Moniz certainly dealt with, what's the overall effect on foreign policy? Is it going to make it much more difficult for us to deal on other foreign policy issues with key partners and allies? A second question that comes up all the time, are we just ceding leadership to China and the EU on climate issues, which certainly our panelists, our China and EU experts can comment on that. And will China take up the cudgel and really become a leader? And again, what about Europe? Well, I think we can be pretty confident on that they will. And what effect is all this going to have on the development of new technologies? Does the decision slow that down at all? And another issue that I know is people are really concerned about is assistance to developing countries with respect to reaching climate goals. And does our withdrawal from that, or notice of withdrawal, have an effect there? But then on the other side of the coin, as Secretary Moniz basically said, is the cow out of the barn already? And will market forces determine progress on lowering emissions, also the role of gas, the role of new technologies, and as Secretary Moniz pointed out, the role of business, which has been very key over the past several months in public-private cooperation. And can we get to bipartisan cooperation on things like carbon carbon pricing. The Schultz-Baker-Summers articles on carbon pricing and providing dividends to create a win-win situation. How much is that going to play? These are not just for this panel, but for your consideration also. Also, Rod Richardson is here, who's going to have an excellent panel after lunch. He's done some fascinating work on tax exemptions with respect to green bonds to encourage investment and also to encourage jobs, which would be seemingly very important to the Trump administration. So I know you'll look forward to what he says this afternoon. So having said all that, let me turn it over first to David Livingston for your. They're limiting themselves to about 3 minutes each, and then we really want to get audience participation.
Great. Well, it's quite the smorgasbord of questions. So
I'll only take you 3 hours.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So I'll try and set the stage a little bit. But let me first say thank you very much to the Atlantic Council, to the organizers who worked so hard to put Tipping Points together. I think it's a great and very and a very much needed event. And thanks to you, Dick, for moderating this and for the great work you're doing with the program over here. I think it's terrific. So I'll take the perhaps, depending on the views of the audience, the perhaps unpopular position of trying to explain what legal risks the Trump administration might have seen in the Paris Agreement, considering that is the rationale that they stated, the public rationale that they stated for announcing their intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And then I'll make a few points just about the legal steps that come next, and then we can broaden out the discussion. So I would first make the point that one's views of the legal risks that emanate from the agreement depend very much on one's views of whether the agreement is legally binding at all. The administration clearly believed that there were at least elements of the agreement that could be construed as legally binding. On the other side, if you talk to the attorneys and the negotiators that worked very hard for many years to make Paris happen, they explicitly say that they designed this in such a way that it would not be legally binding. They tried to make this as flexible as they could possibly make it in order to avoid many of the pitfalls of the Kyoto Protocol and in order to get China and India and other developing countries into the agreement with their own commitments, which was perhaps the major fatal flaw of all previous attempts to address climate change globally. So some contend, however, I will acknowledge, some contend that with the exception of provisions in the Paris Agreement that are clearly written in aspirational language, countries will aspire to, countries will make every effort to, et cetera, et cetera. With the exception of those provisions, like Article 4.4, that are written in aspirational language, that the Paris Agreement is otherwise binding under international law. Others, as I noted, think that the agreement is generally non-binding without differentiating between its terms or articles. There's another group of folks who believe that as a matter of constitutional law, the Senate's advice and consent was required for the U.S. to join the Paris Agreement. And according to this view, since the United States never fully assented to be bound because President Obama didn't submit the agreement to the Senate, it was never kind of ratified, and it doesn't have that legal force. So again, it very much depends on what your beliefs are about the legal nature of the agreement. But I would note that the overwhelming majority of those who are involved in its drafting believe that it is completely legally non-binding. There's also an interesting note here that there's a sort of dormant section in the Clean Air Act here in the United States called Section 115, which affords EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the power to essentially impose regulations or impose measures meant to address public health and environmental issues that impact other countries, if other countries afford essentially the same protections or essentially the same rights to the United States. This Section 115 has never been used before, and so it's really untested, and we don't know whether this would have perhaps created legal, let's say, legal difficulties for the administration. But this Section 115 of the EPA or of the Clean Air Act might be one of the things that was driving them to interpret legal risks in the agreement. The final thing I should note here before handing it off to my colleagues here on the panel is just that do not interpret the announcement that Trump gave in the Rose Garden as the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. It is in fact not even the legal notification of the intent to withdraw from the agreement. Because under Article 28 of the Paris Agreement, a country can notify its intent to withdraw only 3 years from the entry into force of the agreement. The agreement entered into force November 4th of last year, November 4th, 2016. It means the earliest that the United States can legally submit its intent to withdraw from Paris is November 4th, 2019, and then there's a 1-year process before it's withdrawn. In November 4th, 2020 is the very first day that the United States could be legally withdrawn from the agreement, and it's 1 day after the next presidential election. I'll let you figure out for yourselves the significance of that and the implications.
Was that intentional?
Matthias, please.
Matthias.
Thank you so much. So I want to echo David's thanks to our dear colleagues and partners at Atlantic Council for putting on this wonderful conference. And I just want to add also how impressed I am by the inputs and seeing sort of the combined powers of both the Millennium Leadership Program and ELEAP together in one room. It's really quite astounding. And on the subject of kind of the EU perspective on the Paris Agreement and where we go from here, I'd sort of first take a step back from the announcement in the Rose Garden and sort of give you a little bit of context for the EU perspective. So to start off with, I think there are 3 key pillars for that kind of drive EU climate policy. On the one, it's always been a desire to act on climate change in a global context. The EU has been for 25 years plus been a champion of a multilateral international solution on climate change. But it's been trying to help advance that not only through a variety of dialogues and talking to other countries, but also by actually setting as kind of the second pillar targets for itself. For 2010, that was the case for 2020, and now for 2030, and always a little bit ahead of key milestones in the international negotiations as a means of trying to help drive forward the conversation. And then a third key pillar, because we had, I think it was our dear colleague from Statoil this morning saying, politicians are very good about targets, not so good about measures. So policies and measures and actual instruments for helping achieve those targets is the third pillar. And on that front, the EU has been developing a whole toolbox of stuff over the last 20 years. And we're right now in a process of actually a whole set of, I think, up to sort of 10 or more pieces of legislation being negotiated in parallel that are helping to shape the regulatory landscape for achieving the 2030 targets on renewables, on greenhouse gases, on energy efficiency, and actually on infrastructure and energy security also. Having said all that, there are really a number of challenges that the EU has in advancing its climate policy. On the one hand, there is, of course, the fact that the EU is not a homogeneous bloc of countries, but the political consensus on advancing climate policy is actually hard fought every time. So these negotiations that I mentioned earlier also, they are contentious. They are contentious between countries, inside countries, between the different EU institutions. So this is actually always a struggle. It's not easy to get where these things stand right now. There's also the need, the realization that one needs to much more directly integrate climate and energy policy. We have a new framework for that that's called the Energy Union. And so that comes with all kinds of implications also on what is, again, a very tricky issue, managing cross-border integration within the EU, let's say on markets, energy infrastructure. And that at a time when there's a general question about the internal cohesion of the Union as a whole, so you all know about Brexit or, the Euro crisis and the questions about internal EU solidarity that has posed. So that's another big challenge that also impacts on climate and energy. And then there is the question of how we're going to manage the structural change, the transformation towards decarbonization, because so many sectors will need to fundamentally change. And that's, we're at a stage where for the 2030 targets with like minus 40% emissions reductions and electricity from renewables of up to 50% by 2030, we're moving into territory that is really unknown and where we're having to find new solutions. And so how to manage the social dimension, how to trigger additional innovation, those are also challenges for advancing a new climate policy. And then, of course, there's also the important geopolitical dimension. And so that connects us back with this conversation and the announcement from the US, because the US have always played a very special role in international negotiations, always been or most of the time, been a difficult partner, but especially for Paris, of course, they were absolutely instrumental in getting it done and getting it together. And especially that, US-China collaboration and agreement were key. So the question is, can the EU even fill that void? And I think, I'm afraid I don't have a very clear answer just yet. I think they can definitely not do it by themselves. They cannot replace the US in such arrangements. They don't have the geopolitical leverage. They will have a hard time making up financial gaps, because getting money for payments into other parts of the world on climate change is just as politically contentious as it is here, I would think. So they're certainly in the process of trying to regroup and have made very clear statements of their intent that this is not changing the Paris Agreement, doesn't change an iota of their commitment to the process and implementing it, and they're engaging in additional diplomatic activity to try and get kind of bilateral, multilateral dialogues going that will kind of help sustain the Paris Agreement in what is obviously now going to be an even more kind of polycentric and multi-centric climate governance system.
Let me just jump in for a second before turning it over to Joanne, that we withdrew from an agreement once before. We withdrew. George W. Bush withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001. And I was still our ambassador to the EU at that point in time. And that was a terrible decision, and as is, I think, this decision. And it did affect seriously our relationship with the EU and with EU member states. But in spite of that, because of our conversion, because of our gas, the development of shale gas and the conversion to gas and the electricity market, we've basically led the world in carbon reductions. And so it'll be interesting to see, going back to the question about the marketplace, whether we can continue to do so even not part of the agreement. In any event, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So on your smorgasbord, I'm going to nibble a little bit on the China leadership question and also a little bit on U.S.-China relations. Maybe on the latter, I should say. My very first policy brief that I published back when I started at the Wilson Center was called Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential. So it's about U.S.-China energy and environment and climate cooperation. And it's kind of sad, though I wrote that many years, near the beginning when I started at the Wilson Center, and a lot of it's still so true. I mean, what I've seen is that energy and environment and climate cooperation they've really bloomed into a really fruitful area for the two countries to cooperate. And it's not just the government. I'm glad you mentioned, when we pulled out of the first climate agreement, and under the Bush administration, he wasn't interested in energy cooperation. But you have the U.S. foundations, the NGOs, think tanks like mine and others, who continued working with China, and so that shaping the laws, having exchanges. And so when the Obama administration came on board, it was like hitting the wave, surfing. And so that in the past 8 years with the Obama administration, he was building on what has really been 4 decades of kind of on again, off again energy and environmental and climate cooperation. And I've kind of argued, a lot of people come to my meetings argue this as well. It's one of the few areas where there's goodwill between the two countries, and we know there's lots of tension between them. And so there's many people in my network who are saddened by the the withdrawal, not withdrawal, whatever with the climate agreement, is that of how it's going to affect our relationship with China, right? And so actually, the U.S. and China together, we were the leaders on climate, and now I am optimistic that China is going to move. They're still going to continue, they're cutting back on coal-fired power plants, their renewables are going forward, they're trying to correct problems of getting all those renewables on the grid. I can bore you till those cows actually come home on all the details of how China may or may not keep lowering their CO2 emissions. But you should know this. Most of the people in my network say China has already peaked at coal. They probably have already met their Paris commitment. So, leadership. Wouldn't leadership mean, oh, we've met it, we're going to do more now, right? We're kind of wondering with China, are they really going to do more? I mean, Xi Jinping, he is flirting quite seriously with the idea that we will lead on Paris. Because, he wants to be at the table setting global norms and institutions. But we're not, a lot of people, we feel like that maybe China doesn't really want to do that, because what's the first thing they did after the US pulled out? Hi, Europe. Hello, country of California, right? And that China, I'm not saying that, they are strong, they've got capacity, but they also have a lot of gaps. And that having these partnerships, you have to have China. Right. I mean, you need China, and it's so. But again, I'm not crying in my coffee yet. I mean, because I still see the cooperation continuing with or without the federal lead. But also, but maybe on the sad side, or bad, good, bad, ugly of China's leadership on climate. I mean, they are having difficulty in they're decreasing coal-fired power plants, but a lot of provinces, they're still building some of their own because they can make more money from them. They don't want to buy the solar or wind power coming in. Overseas, the Belt and Road project, China, they've doing lots of investment globally. 80% of all their global investments in energy is going to fossil fuels. There's like 100 projects under the Belt and Road project that are coal-fired power plants. That said, it's not all black and white, ladies and gentlemen, because the countries that, Pakistan, they're saying, bring it on, right? But the Chinese, the sad part is they're not sending their cleanest coal technologies. Last little factoid, and then you yank me off the stage here, is that in the 100 top coal-fired power plants in China are way more efficient than our 100 top ones. The 100 top US coal-fired power plants do not meet China's standards, right? But those are not, these are the ultra supercritical coal-fired power plants. These are not the ones that are being built in Pakistan and other countries. Some of it is that the Chinese don't necessarily, it's not about, they're more expensive and the countries don't necessarily want to buy them. And also, as they've closed down these smaller, dirtier coal-fired power plants, there's engineers and folks who can actually do that work, and they're the ones being sent over to build them in the other countries. All right, I think I've given them enough information to be dangerous. Okay. You ready to open it up?
So let's open it up for your comments and your questions. And don't be shy, because if you don't, we have 40 minutes left. I taught law school classes for several years, and I'm perfectly capable of using the Socratic method. So let's see some hands. I only see one.
Two.
Brave two.
Three.
One brave person. Three. Okay, right here in the front.
The fact that it's a town hall doesn't mean that we're all sort of walking around, right?
Right.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your thoughts. I'm Andrea. I'm a policy analyst at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, so I do work on e-policy, and I would be actually interested to hear both Matthias from you and Jennifer on the future of the EU-China cooperation, and what are your thoughts where this could lead to, and what are the options?
Should we collect a few? I think I prefer that.
Okay, we could do that. Why don't we have another? Good idea. Let's have okay, in the back row.
Good morning. My name is Erin, and I'll build on my colleague's question on cooperation and focus that question in the UN Security Council. I'm a 2017 Millennium Fellow working at the State Department with many, many years of multilateral experience. And one thing that struck me is the absence of climate change as part of the peace and security agenda over, the first meeting the Council had on peace and security and climate change was 2007. I think this is an opportunity for China, and particularly the EU countries in the P3, to move this agenda forward and, to some extent, leverage the United States into opening up this debate. Do you see any prospects for that, particularly now that France is led by Macron and more friendly climate change policies? Also, as you said, China could really benefit from a change in perception vis-a-vis the UN Security Council. It's typically seen as a spoiler. Do you think this is something that China would see as an opportunity as well? Thanks.
Okay, well, let's take one more question. There was a hand over here, been towards the back. We'll come to the.
And
Hi,
we'll accept comments, right?
Yeah,
as
well, you
well.
can do
Sort of
comments.
this
You
is
don't
not-
have to ask a question.
Exactly.
Sounds good.
But you can ask.
You can ask a question.
Hi, I'm Linus. I work with the World Resources Institute on urban transportation and climate policies. Governor Whitman, who was here yesterday, mentioned the possibility of carbon tariffs, so climate-related trade sanctions, that I heard was also floated around quickly by the U.S. delegation to Marrakesh after the election. My question is, what's the prospect of this form of tough leadership by other blocs on the U.S., and do you think that's patriotic or unpatriotic to float around this idea in the U.S.? Be curious.
Okay. Who wants to start? Don't all scream at once.
So we have future EU relations, the climate security on the UN, and then patriotism.
I'm happy to take this question on the carbon tariffs, actually.
Yeah.
I think this is really interesting. I think it's an area to watch. So, and correct me if I'm not understanding the question correctly, but particularly in the EU, this has been discussed a bit, carbon border adjustments. So during the French presidential primary and the Républicain primary, Nicolas Sarkozy made a point of saying, maybe we should consider, if the U.S. ever does pull out of the Paris Agreement, levying a 2 to 5% border adjustment on all imported goods to account for the fact that they have the illegal subsidy of not correctly pricing the carbon externality in the United States, or participating in this global climate framework. That was seconded by, after the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, Martin Schulz, the challenger to Merkel in the German chancellor election, said, surely we can't, there's no further progress to be had on TTIP. We basically can't make any more concessions on tariff levels if the United States is outside of the Paris Agreement. This was interesting as well. And then also from the private sector, the chairman of ArcelorMittal, the steel major, has also voted the idea of Europe having a carbon border adjustment.
Let me. When other countries imposed some kind of sanctions or tariffs, there would be some serious WTO questions.
Exactly.
And whether or not one could justify this under some kind of national security exemption would be actually an interesting question. But aside from that, the politics of doing that could be very, let's say, counterproductive if it, resulted in some kind of trade war.
So I
think it's very unlikely that this would happen.
This is the point I would make, I think it's extremely risky and dangerous to go down this step, because in academic circles, there's the idea that you could get a virtuous trade war that would essentially allow carbon pricing to blossom, or carbon mechanism to blossom, as a result of carbon border adjustments. I think this really downplays the possibility that retaliation happens in different areas and in different sectors. If the Trump administration will not respond by erecting its own carbon price, so it keeps that revenue here instead of sending it to Europe, it will simply retaliate by stiffer penalties on steel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. And to your point in WTO, it would test the WTO in Article 21, the national security exemption, like it's never been tested before. And I think it would ultimately be to the detriment of the multilateral trade system.
But if I just may add to that, I think sort of you also need to sort of see what are the audiences that these statements are being made to. And I think the three examples you just quoted are basically all for the benefit of European audiences and electoral audiences largely. So sort of you need to understand that in that context. That doesn't mean that there isn't sort of also an audience sort of that is on the other side of the Atlantic that should be hearing that Europeans aren't quite pleased with the current state of affairs and are potentially willing to contemplate some kind of reaction to it. So I think there is both, but I think the primary driver is that this is an issue for kind of inside the EU, but I would otherwise share the sentiment that it's sort of the likelihood of that materializing would sort of is very low and would only be happening as part of if the bigger overall picture, including these other bilateral trade arrangements, sort of escalates in some form.
Okay, but there were the two earlier questions.
Yeah. So with the
China, Europe.
the EU, China, Europe. I mean, while I think that we could duel this stuff, I think the U.S. in terms of our foundation, NGOs, and think tanks and universities, there's been a lot more engagement with China on environment and climate, but that doesn't mean you guys are slackers. I mean, because the Chinese have been working particularly more with the governments like the Germans and the UK folks on a lot of it, like auto emissions but your foundations, like in the UK, the Children Investment Fund Foundation supports a number of U.S. NGOs like NRDC that's really been key in helping to promote like coal cap, consumption cap in China. So, I mean, I kind of see that this kind of cooperation will continue, but I'll have to defer to you on whether or not you made in your opening comments whether or not the European governments will kind of come together in their cooperation with China.
I think that's a tricky one. Sort of Andrea, you know well that sort of Europeans have a hard time getting a joint foreign policy together as a European foreign and security policy, and EU-China relations on all these other dimensions aren't always easy. So in the UK, for example, steel workers, sort of are protesting sort of against Chinese steel imports to Europe, or sort of the potential sort of dumping prices on the world market. And so there are a variety of areas where sort of the relationship is problematic. But there is a kind of a need right now, I think, that's perceived on both sides for engaging on climate-related issues. And so I think they'll have to come up with ways of strengthening the existing collaboration, which certainly, indeed, on the governmental level exists sort of on the areas such as the Europeans have been for years supporting the development of the carbon market programs in the pilot regions and cities, but also now the national system that China is
which is supposed
developing.
to launch this year, people.
Yes,
it's going to be spectacular or not. Yeah, but so it's good.
I think that's a very good question.
We don't know, but again, Xi Jinping, again, he's seeing his legacy in this. So there is actually a lot of political push behind it, and also the comment about the security. I mean, one of the China's concerned about their air pollution issue, which is obviously something that galvanized them to want to lower the coal emissions. But they also do see the security concerns about the flooding, the increased storms, the droughts, and so. I mean, it's been in Chinese policy documents for a while that they see climate change as a security threat to the country. So I think they'd be open. They'd be open to these kind of conversations at the UN. So.
It was also under Germany's G7 presidency that we got a major report on climate-related or climate as a threat multiplier, climate as a source of compound risk across refugee issues, a number of conflict issues. So it should be said that at least under Germany's G7 presidency, there were some attempts to address that security angle.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, going back on the security question and the sanctions question and so forth, and back to the first question that I raised in my introduction, I think that the effect, rather than any kind of direct action by countries, I think it will have an indirect effect from the standpoint of making our foreign policy in general a lot more difficult to gain cooperation. It's going to be difficult anyway, but even more difficult to gain cooperation from various countries as a result of this decision. Okay, more questions. Okay, I see 2 here, 3, and then we'll come on the next round over here.
Ambassador Morningstar and our illustrious panel. You mentioned at the beginning the tax exemption for green bonds. Which I will be talking about later, and at risk of stealing thunder from myself later, I'm curious. We just mentioned tariffs and the political risk of doing that, and I think that possibly a lot of that political risk has to do with the fact that the tariffs are a punishment mechanism, and punishment mechanisms produce opposition. They produce blowback. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes policies based on those are difficult to pass. Tax exemption is a tax cut. It's a reward. It's a positive feedback loop. Might that be a mechanism for an international agreement on tax exemption globally for green bonds? And do you think that this is an interesting area to explore, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay, we'll answer that. Let's get the
gathering.
Okay, so I'm not going to talk on that point. I'm tempted to. My name is Max Grunig from the Ecologic Institute. I'm just going to ask two questions in a way. One is, if you look at the current declaration or the recent declaration in the Rose Garden and the reaction, should that just be taken as also a domestic declaration to domestic voters? And as David, you mentioned, actually legally, this is not really anything yet or can't be legally recognized as anything. So should the other international community basically go on with business and not shut the doors? Or should there be some reaction like we see that with the Brexit, where the European partners of the UK are reacting almost with anger towards the UK and making this an emotional issue and making it maybe even more difficult if there's going to be this turnaround, as you hinted at, in 2020, possibly. So this is one question, and then slightly linked to the money side is the climate funding. Should the international community just step up and say, oh, don't worry, we cover that, and be generous in light of being accommodating, or be strong and strict and insist and be vigorous? So that's
Okay,
it.
thank you. And then Andrew.
Thank you. So I want to dig in on leadership, right? So Chinese leadership, European leadership is going to replace American leadership, and it's everybody puts this out as a good thing. We need leadership. Somebody leads us, but just because you're leading doesn't mean you're going in the same direction, right? You know, so you could be leading towards more more action on climate change, but what's the difference between Chinese leadership, between EU leadership, and American leadership? Because, you know, if you look at both Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, you see real sort of kind of keys in American leadership on climate. One, voluntary. You know, we don't want, we want voluntary. We want the whole world to do something. That was the whole problem with Kyoto, was that, you know, this difference between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, right? And that's why the Senate wouldn't ratify it. So we want the whole world to put something out there, and we don't want it to be legally binding. And we really want market-based mechanisms. And then we heard Secretary Moniz, and I think this is a key part of it too, is the talk about mission innovation and really the business innovation agenda. You don't hear that from Europeans when they talk about climate. It's about, okay, we need a cap and we need to just get to work. And I'm not clear yet what the Chinese leadership looks like, but knowing kind of some about the Chinese way of doing business and governing, it seems like it would be more centralized, more government-led, more 5-year plans of stuff, versus separating it back and letting the business lead, letting markets work on it. So I guess can you dive into that a little bit more? Where does Chinese leadership take us that American leadership wouldn't have taken us?
Okay, let me just to start off on the question on green bond exemptions. I think it relates to the innovation point as well. That, yeah, I think we have to look at all these things, and these are the kinds of things that I don't think we should give up on the Trump administration. They're here, you know. I mean, we can moan and do whatever, but they're here at least until 2020. But they are interested in innovation, competitiveness, and I think that's where the EU and the US has to cooperate, possibly, and we'll hear more about the green bonds, but on other things, you know, on other things as well.
Can I make a point to that, actually,
Yeah.
Dick, that connects with Max's point, which is, so yes, read this as first and foremost about speaking to a domestic audience and not about a statement on the Paris Agreement itself, right? The Paris Agreement is a tool or a mechanism for getting out there and making a press conference and saying some things that ultimately have no legal effect yet for the next few years, that's meant to targeting a interpreted audience that is interpreted to be the president's political base. That being said, I think we have we have reason to believe that the administration may be overestimating the impact that this has or the size of this base that's satisfied by withdrawal from the agreement. Early polling shows that it's fairly unpopular, the withdrawal or the announced withdrawal. Furthermore, let's just have a little bit of realism as well about what is the actual picture in the energy market today. So there are 77,000 more or less coal jobs in the United States today. That's less than the Arby's chain. And just because, but I mean, this is really important to remember.
Arby's isn't even that good.
Right. And by the way, every time we put in a new Sweet Green or a Chipotle down the block, we don't talk about a war on roast beef, right? So let's keep that in mind. Secondly, the 5 states in the United States that produce the highest percentage of their energy from wind are all red states that went for Trump. These governors aren't doing it because they care about climate change. You've got senators like Chuck Grassley saying you'll pull those wind subsidies over my dead body. That's because they buy into the competitiveness aspect, they buy into the jobs aspect. So there's room here to find a solution or to find some solutions over the next 3 years. And to your point, Dick, that you brought up, after Bush withdrew from Kyoto in 2001, 2005, we got a major piece of energy policy legislation, followed up by EISA, another piece of major energy policy legislation in 2007. So, and this included a number of tax credits for renewables that laid the groundwork for what we see today. So I think there is a danger in Europe overreacting to this and thinking that it's truly about them, that it's a loss of trust. Surely, I mean, this reinforces the fact that the Trump administration is skeptical of multilateralism. We knew that. We already knew that. So I think it's very much in Europe's interest to be very cool-headed and rational about their own interests in this and where they might intersect. On the green bonds thing is one area.
Should we maybe would it be possible to just tag on so that we can expand the topic? Because I think I would also recommend not misreading sort of the perception of this development sort of in the EU, because the EU doesn't sort of feel necessarily slighted or affronted by this directly. The reason why basically on the same day several heads of state and government sort of stood up and issued a joint statement to make sure that it was clear that their commitment was unwavering is because they sort of had to try and contain any possible fallout and sort of any kind of potential effect on other countries, also signaling sort of that they might now consider leaving. So it's all about not losing the achievement of the Paris Agreement. It's not so much about an influence on the EU. So, I think that's it's a more of a geopolitical sort of interest. It's not a more narrow EU interest, although there is an EU economic interest in sort of keeping that agenda alive. I don't want to discount that.
You were going to say something about the green bonds.
Yeah.
I think the green bonds thing is absolutely the sort of, you've got the bads and the goods, right? There's pricing bads, which is carbon pricing, has no chance in red states. And all the states that are in the We Are Still In coalition are mostly coastal blue states. But like I said, a lot of the states that are actually producing the most renewable energy, or is a proportion of their energy mix, are the red states. That's because it's about supporting goods, right? It's tax cuts, like you said, for green investment. The key thing here is harmonization at the global level. When you were talking about creating a market for this, so they're really promising things. China, People's Bank of China is coming up with guidelines for green bonds. Just recently, the India Securities and Exchange Board published its own principles for green bonds. I think the next step here, we've got two things. Number one is alignment of all these principles, of all these guidelines, so that we do create a global liquid market, which is crucial for scale. And the second one is proving that these green bonds are delivering lower cost of capital than they would otherwise have. If you show that you're delivering lower cost of capital for green investment, that's when you start to tip the scales.
Okay. I want to, before I get to the China leadership thing, one thing that I want, when you talk, hands down, we're talking about cows and Arby's. I just think this is so much fun. But in terms of like the coal job transition, I mean, I'm in conversations with folks out in Montana, in West Virginia, Kentucky. I'm having a meeting next month about comparing U.S.-China coal transitions. What are they doing on jobs? And just so you know, that in China, there's a few more people in the coal industry than Arby's. All right. But I feel like that with the Trump administration is here, and I think it's an opportunity for those of us, particularly in D.C., let's switch our conversation and let's talk about, well, what about the coal transition? And bringing, what is China doing? What are we doing? What are lessons learned? Because China is looking for answers to that, because they got a whole lot more working in the coal sector.
So are we, by the way, looking for answers.
All
so
right.
this is another topic I think that actually could be a subject for sort of a dialogues between the EU and China, but also for other multilateral fora.
So we have to talk later. Maybe
Sure.
have you guys come and talk as well. What does Chinese leadership look like on climate? It's like, well, I think so much of what they do, they are focused domestically, right? I mean, that everyone understands that. I mean, that said, that one little point I forgot to mention in terms of like that's veering towards the not so good on leadership with climate is an industry most of you have never heard of. You ever heard of coal to gas, coal to liquids, coal to chemicals? There could be coal to ice cream, I'm not sure. But China is making stuff out of coal because they have it. The plans right now of coal, we call it the coal conversion sector. The plants that exist in coal conversions, the ones that are being built and ones being planned, when those all come online by the end of this next few years, that'll be equivalent to China's current 10% of all their CO2 emissions, right? And so but again, it's back to that jobs issue. You're losing jobs in the coal to power sector, so the local governments are shifting them. So it's an issue of whether or not Beijing can actually control what the provinces are doing, but the provinces are doing what they want to do to maintain stability. I think China is, maybe in terms of their broader vision, in terms of, they bought onto with the U.S. vision of markets. I mean, again, markets with Chinese characteristics, but why is it that Xi Jinping said he wanted, CO2 emissions trading? And they're also talking, following the U.S. kind of lead on, another nerdy topic, green dispatch. That China's working with a number of U.S. organizations on how, when you're going to put power on the grid, that maybe they're going to try to prioritize cleaner power. So they're trying to create institutions within China to really shift. They're doing green dispatch because that's going to make the market. So I think the Chinese really, they're with the whole market thing, and they also they embrace the voluntary, not so keen on monitoring by international organizations. And so that again, leadership, within the country, they're quite proud of what they're doing. But yeah, I don't see them being quite the same as what the U.S. was.
Okay, we have we're actually down to our last 15 minutes. So let me get 3 questions. You've been waiting for a long time. Before you do it, okay, I'll go to the back afterwards, and then we'll come back here. Okay.
Well, thank you, Jean-François Boita. Not so much questions, but a couple of comments. Number one on the border tax, whatever. The Climate Leadership Council actually makes a very good argument for that in their paper, saying we the people should not pay the price for those who don't care about the environment. And the president himself made a very good argument, saying with Paris, we are less competitive. Without Paris, we are more competitive. Pascal Lamy, by the way, the DG of the WTO, a few years back said that, yes, an environmental tax would make sense with the WTO. And I think that there will be trade wars way before, we have a border for climate reasons in Europe or anywhere else, because you'll have trade wars after the sections 232 here in this country, because that's what this administration wants. And getting out of Paris is just part of the wall strategy or the wall syndrome. Like we build walls, close the doors, stay within ourselves, and we give a big middle finger to the world, which really was a message in the Rose Garden, period.
Thank you.
There is no argumentation behind that. It was and it's a way to have fun, you feel good, but maybe you have to pay a price for that. On EU leadership, I wish there will be EU leadership. I spent 5 years in Berlin as part of the French embassy, head of the economic department. There is so much competition, so many rivalries between European companies, especially in the energy sector, that it's going to be very difficult to move forward with EU leadership. So let us pray for Chinese leadership.
Right, wrong, or indifferent, China doesn't have 27 or 28 members, 27, I guess, member states to have to deal with.
Let's not forget that earlier on you all implied that to be a leader also means you have to have cash
Right.
or investing.
Right. There are 2 questions back there.
Was there one right here?
We may go to it, and then we'll go here because that was more of a comment than a question. Yeah.
I'm going to phrase
Your
this
name,
with hi, I'm Sarah Hunt. I'm with the American Legislative Exchange Council. And I want to phrase this with two sort of opening bumpers. One of my initiatives is all of the above jobs. I love wind jobs. I love solar jobs. I love oil jobs, coal jobs, nuclear, you name it. Secondly, I'm not exactly sure how to articulate this question. But I would love to hear from you all how you think we can interject some cultural sensitivity into the conversation around coal jobs. Because, hey, we're all nerds. We can look and see natural gas fuel switching in the electricity sector is driving down demand for coal. Automation is driving down the need for jobs in coal as well as other, manual labor sectors. There are more wind and solar jobs in Texas than there are in the entire country in coal. We can all see this, but when we say that, it overlooks the fact that talking about coal jobs, I think this is my perception. I'd love to hear other opinions if people think I'm wrong. The discussion of coal jobs is really a proxy for the discussion of the overlooked people and the overlooked cultures in Middle America and those who are really losers in the transition to a global economy, losers in the transition to automation and the AI economy. How can we be culturally sensitive to that reality? Because I think as advocates, we're not going to get anywhere on the American leadership in energy question, the American leadership in the transition to a new high-tech economy until we say, how are we going to help these people? It's not just about jobs. They want jobs, but it's their communities and their culture and their way of life. And that's really what we're talking about. So I would love to hear your feedback on that.
Just before we get to the next question, I think that's a really good point. And sometimes when we talk about 77,000 coal jobs versus whatever it is in wind and solar, 250,000 or whatever it is, that it's a zero-sum game. It's not.
It's not.
And so I think the points that, they'll comment too, but I think the points that you're making are very legitimate points in the back.
First of all, thank you all so much for speaking today. I think some really interesting points have been raised. I'm an intern at the Wilson Center, actually with Jennifer this summer, so I have the good fortune of working with her. But I want to ask you all quickly for your thoughts, just basing off of Governor Jerry Brown's recent visit to China and some of the agreements he signed there. What do you think possible cooperation or collaboration between China, EU, and the U.S. could look like with maybe state governors, city and industry leaders, people involved in energy who are not in the national governments or representatives from like multilateral organizations like the UN? I guess in the short term and in the near future, what do you think that kind of cooperation would look like? And could it be a channel to circumvent maybe obstacles that could arise, for example, in the UN or other multilateral agencies? Thank you.
Okay, let's take the question right here. We may not have enough time.
Thanks. I'll try to be quick. My name is Sadian Doko. I worked until recently for several years with the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Change Secretariat. My question is actually related to the second question that Max asked earlier. One of the key to get to the Paris Agreement was the promise of mobilizing funding for developing countries, not only for their mitigation effort, but also to support them to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change, in particular in least developed countries and small island developing states. With the current stand of the US administration on climate change, regardless of the legally binding statement or not in the Rose Garden, but there's definitely already a freeze in the financial support towards developing countries. We are talking about leadership. How do you foresee this gap being filled in? Who will be filling in this gap? Because I think not having an answer for that will tremendously undermine the confidence in actually implementing the Paris Agreement.
Right. What a smorgasbord question. So, whoever wants to respond to
should we try and sort of do this by topic so that we can
can I, on the cultural sensitivity thing, that's cultural sensitivity around coal. That's why, I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. But starting next month, I'm going to be having more meetings, talking about what's happening with coal jobs and energy jobs. Because I feel like, it's a fruitful conversation and one that hasn't really happened. Center for American Progress has been putting out some reports on this issue too. But no, I think I love that question. I think that, I'm speaking for the think tanky world here, and I think you'd agree. we need to look at this topic too, about understand it more subtly.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I would say too, it starts with. I'm absolutely all for approaching this in a culturally sensitive way, and also seeing this as an opportunity to do economic adjustment better. I think we really need to do better, for example, on trade adjustment assistance here in the United States. I think we have failed to do it well. And this presents, perhaps, when we talk about energy transitions, an opportunity to revisit that and figure out what actually works. And not to just say these communities lost out, but to invest in them and to say they have a role in the economy we're moving towards. That being said, I will also stand very firmly, though, by the belief that the cultural sensitivity begins with honesty. And it begins not with lying to people and saying that this president or this regulation is solely responsible for your community losing this many jobs and that those jobs are coming back. It's about saying, no, look, this isn't just a U.S. phenomena. India says it won't build any new coal plants after 2022. Not only is coal demand in the United States going down, but there are developments in the world that mean that this industry is changing. How are we going to work together to make sure that all citizens fit into the economy we're entering into? And I think that is honestly the most respectful thing to do, is to start from a point of honesty.
Nothing to add.
Next question.
Because there were so many. Dear Andrew is now sort of, with his leadership questions, now left the room. I would have sort of a bone to pick with
what
him
about
on
the
that.
subnational-
but I can
the
do that
subnational
bilaterally.
cooperation?
Yes, indeed. I think that's still sort of, you mean with the California, EU, China triangle, for example.
Or cities.
I absolutely. I think that's very worthwhile exploring, especially sort of on these multiple levels, the collaboration. There are a variety of fora that already exist to bring together regions, cities, in addition to the kind of the higher level of states and countries. And I think we've mentioned a couple of topics that could be worthwhile exploring in this context. And I would just add that I think even structural change in other types of industries, even in the ones that are currently, say, between the EU and China, problematic, such as manufacturing, steel, for example, could be interesting topics for exchange and collaboration. Because they're ultimately sort of getting these manufacturing sectors decarbonized. Sort of can only really work well if you either find sort of good substitutes that help you create new economic opportunities in also industrial sectors in developed countries, industrialized countries, or you find some other kinds of arrangements where you don't basically then have just the emissions kind of move from one part of the globe to another, because that wouldn't be sort of helping us in the global climate change challenge. And there was another point to add. So on the financing, I think, sort of, which is also that I'll leave sort of maybe for somebody else to pick up, because I said it's so difficult in the EU. But on the leadership question, I just want to add that I think we have to look beyond these big axes as well. So there are other parts of the world that are really advancing a progressive climate change agenda, that are seeing the benefits, especially sort of moving to other types of energy. Mexico is a leader on climate change. There are several other countries. The German environment minister is actually, I think, just returned from Costa Rica, signing a new collaboration agreement with them, this week. And so I think there are a lot of overall pieces to the puzzle, and a lot of areas where new leadership could emerge.
But back to the last question, how much harm does our pulling away from the development assistance to
I think that's
countries,
that's a real problem.
Yeah. And I'd argue that might be one of the biggest issues by our, maybe the biggest issue of our pulling out.
I would actually like to ask our U.S. colleagues here, do you see sort of possibilities, or even, I don't know whether it's legally possible, that indeed other parts than the federal government could help make up for the gap?
Totally. Well, I think it's important on Green Climate Fund, at least. Remember that the developed country Green Climate Fund commitments, at least as they were originally envisioned by the U.S. negotiators, were never meant to be purely government, purely public money. It was meant to be public money that helps crowd in private money that constitutes the entire U.S. commitment to the Green Climate Fund. U.S. has already contributed $1 billion of the $3 billion that it committed. And it's important to remember here, too, that it's not like Trump just shut the tap. The tap was dry. It was difficult to get through this current Congress any additional Green Climate Fund funding. So what it essentially did is it memorialized, or it just symbolized the fact that practically we were already having difficulty with Green Climate Fund funding. The thing that I would say is, so from the U.S., sure, I mean, I would welcome any sort of crowdfunding approach. Interesting leaders like Bloomberg or others working on finding alternative sources and creating a diplomatic mission around that. But China also with all of the Silk Road Fund, with the BRICS Bank, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I wonder if we're going to see more pressure on China to put green screens on that.
Well, I mean, it's just that in terms of the Chinese banks that are investing overseas, they don't have the best record on being green. I mean, it's said that's their goal, but also China, their mindset on they're investing, and they're not interested in aid as much. So that's kind of a challenge. But that said, but back to what you mentioned about Bloomberg, I think, which links your question with the one about subnational governments, is that the city-to-city cooperation. I mean, I feel like when you look at, I do work on China and India, these giant cities that are growing, and that these cities are at the front lines of addressing climate change. And so I think that seeing, a lot of the foundation world, C40 and other things kind of trying to work on cities. I do my little stuff focused on, believe it or not, sludge, methane capture, waste to energy stuff. I'm trying to be a matchmaker on that because it's basic technology used in the US and finding models in China. I mean, because methane emissions, we didn't even talk about methane today.
Yeah.
That it could be even bigger than CO2. So I see potential in like the city-to-city type cooperation because in some cases, it's not always just money. It's often sometimes, for cities, management practices, policies. But no, I don't know if I'm going to see China opening their pockets to.
Okay, our time is up, and I didn't have to use the Socratic method.
You ran
Thank
a
you
taut
Thank you for all of your questions. Please don't run off quickly because I think our artist is coming in. But thank you to, I think, an excellent panel here.
Thank you for good
Thank you.
Thanks
for the questions.
Now, what about?
Hello. My name is Umaid Sharifi. I am coming from Afghanistan. I have a small organization called Art Lords. We are the positive lords. We call ourselves the constructive lords, not the warlords and drug lords. I do painting all over the country on the streets with the people, and the messages are always about social change, fighting corruption, transitional justice, women's rights, and stuff like that. So it's more of messaging than the real art. So we came here thanks to Atlantic Council and Jonathan especially. And by the way, I'm a fellow from 2016, a Millennium Fellow as well. We just did a piece of mural, and I really want to thank you, the ones who helped me paint it. Thank you. We wouldn't be able to do it in one day if it wasn't for you. And there was a lot of you who are really morally supporting me. Like, go mate, go strong. So thank you very much. Please take your time during lunch to sign the mural. So I will take the pictures and we'll take it back home and show it to all Afghans because they love our work and they're very proud of me that I'm here and painting with you. So thank you. Have a good lunch.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody. You're free.